For today's video, what I want to do is take you through some of the basic modeling functionality of Fusion 360. Primarily what we're going to be doing is parametric modeling and then using some of our base features to create some bodies from those models. Before we begin this video, if you haven't already, I would really like you to refer to the week 1 homework announcement, and I would like you to watch and follow along with your CAD software on some of these Autodesk videos, which will give you a really great sort of overview of some of the things that I've covered as well, but we'll cover some other elements too. And that will just make keeping up with me that little bit easier. Okay, so before you start following this video, jump onto the homework announcement, jump onto this link, and I want you to watch up to lesson 10. So up to and including lesson 10, which is extruding 2D sketch to 3D model the sort trigger. Okay, you need to make sure that you download the elements. As you go through, it will tell you when to download and all the rest, and you can watch the videos here. Okay, so now that you've completed doing that, back into Fusion, you would have had a bit of a play and use some of the modeling, become a little bit more familiar with some of the modeling aspects and how to draw a sketch, okay, and essentially the point of drawing a sketch. So before we start, it's good practice to get into the practice of creating a new component, okay, when you start a new project, okay. Now, the reason why we want to have this is because when I start modeling, the elements that I model are going to end up within this component. Later down the track, when I start doing assemblies, I might model multiple components within the one project, okay? And I want those to be split up. If I don't do this at the start, it means that all my bodies and things will end up in this part of the browser tree, okay? And it becomes a bit of a mess. It also can be painful for your timeline in terms of going back and editing things, being able to move things around, okay? So, good practice, whenever you're building something, first thing you do is create a new component and start building away. So the first thing I want to do is I'm going to create a sketch. Create the sketch, obviously now we can see that we've got our planes illuminated, and I can select a different plane. For this one, I'm just going to go onto the top plane. Once I've gone into the top plane, we can see that these toolbars have changed. The create is now all specific to drawing. The modify, is all specific to drawing as well. And then we have this guy called constraints. Okay, and this is something I want to have a little bit of a chat about today. So, first I'm just going to draw a rectangle, okay? Now notice when I drew that rectangle starting at the origin. Now there's a specific reason why I did that. By starting at the origin, I've fixed this corner of the rectangle to that origin, okay? By doing that, you'll see that when I'm not over the sketch, I've got 2 blue lines and 2 black lines of the outline of the sketch. What this means is if I try to grab either of those black lines, I can't move them. However, if I try to grab one of the blue lines or the point between the 2 blue lines, they're free to move. Okay? Now the reason why this doesn't move here is because when I set the first point of the rectangle to the origin, okay, I've essentially fixed it to that point, and that's called what we use in Fusion, a constraint. So constraints are really useful because we can build geometric relationships between things, and also it's an active control. The issue is that if we don't have constraints on something and we start building a really complex model, we might accidentally adjust something that wasn't constrained, and by doing that, that can upset geometry and features downstream. So I've got my initial rectangle, and then I'm going to go, okay, let's put a dimension on this. and I'll make it 500. Notice now I've only got one blue line. That blue line I can still move because there's no dimension on this side or relation. However, I can move this up and down now because I have my 500mm dimension. So the sketch is nearly fully defined. When the sketch is fully defined, I cannot change it whatsoever. I have two options. I can put another dimension on there. Now we have a 500 by 500mm square. I can also update this, so say if I wanted a rectangle, I can update it. Or there's a few other options. One that I want to show you now is what's called equal. So if I hit equal, I click on this, I click on this. See how we now have those two equals symbols have come in? Hit the escape key. Now when I try to drag this, it's equally constrained, and we can see that because it's black. So constraints are essentially geometric methods, okay, for us to build controls within our drawing, okay? And by doing so, we build more robust pieces of reference geometry. So a drawing is a piece of reference geometry, I suppose. And that in turn makes things more robust, okay? It's harder to upset downstream. You can not use constraints if you so wish, so you can draw and not use constraints or only loosely dimension things, but you'll find that you'll get much better results with your modeling and in turn with your 3D printing if you do constrain things. Maybe you don't constrain things completely, but you want to be using at least some level of constraint, okay, especially when you're starting to do fine detail and generate assemblies where things have to fit together. So constraining is quite important, and there's a range of different geometric constraints that we can use. For another example, if I just come over here and draw these two circles, okay, there's a couple of different constraints I can use to do different things. If I click both of these circles and hit concentric, you'll see that I now have a concentric relation of those two circles, okay? So both those circles share the same center point, okay? So it's a really useful constraint we might want to use if we've got two circles, we're generating an object and we want two pieces to reference the same center point. Another really common constraint we might use is we have a line and we want that line to be what we call a tangent. Okay, so a tangent is where that line passes and just touches that side. Okay? Let's just add a few more lines here. Okay. So what I've done here, you can see on this side, is I've drawn up to it, but I haven't got that tangent, and I know because when I drag this I can move it along. If I grab this, and I grab this, and I tangent, now I know that I've got this really nice piece of drawing reference where it's just touching the edge of that. Now the issue here is that I've got all this architecture inside here and these daggy bits. That's where the modifier comes in handy. So I can trim, I can come along and I can cut these sections out. You can see which sections it's letting me cut out because it illuminates black. That's some of the basic constraints. There's a whole range of constraints here. Coincident is another important one. If I have two lines and for some reason my lines are not connected, I can grab these 2 points and I can coincident and they'll come together. Now they're joined. So constraints are a really useful way of saving ourselves time and energy, or just being able to do things we may not have successfully been able to do with drafting. Okay. Always refer to those, always have a look at those because they're going to be really useful for you when you're working. Okay. So we've got a bunch of drawings in here that we've played around with. I'm just going to lose some of these because I don't need them. But what I might do is I'm going to delete and I'm going to leave this guy here. Okay. And I'm going to finish my sketch. So I've got a drawing here. Okay. We can see in the component side down here, we've got our first sketch. Okay. Inside our component. We've also got the origin and planes relevant to this component. Okay, so you can have multiple sets of origins and planes because you can have multiple components. Okay, if you have multiple components and your work disappears or it's in this sort of grayed out phase, it's because you're active in the wrong component. If I come back to this guy, activate, suddenly I'm back in this component. So I've got my first piece of architecture. And you can see, because it's unconstrained, I can yank it and pull it around. Okay? This is what I was talking about earlier. This can be a bit problematic down the track when I start to build things. So I'll just come back in and I'll just edit this sketch, have a bit of a look at it, and let's just put a few constraints on it. So you can see there that I just used a range of dimensions and constraints. I used my equal constraints, so that line, that line, that line are all the same length. I used a dimension on here and a dimension here, and I've got a fully constrained object. Nothing's moving. Great. Now, what I want to do is I'm going to have a look at an extrude. An extrude is the most basic sort of function that we have. Extrude's looking for a profile, it's looking for my sketch, and something to note here is because I have two pieces of architecture, of geometry here, Fusion is going to be a little bit, sometimes it may be confused, but often it's quite smart at picking up, okay, you've got two pieces here, so you're probably looking just to extrude that much. When you're in here, I can actually select multiple pieces of geometry to extrude. So you can see I can extrude this as an entire body, or I can just extrude one piece of it. So I'm just going to go ahead and extrude this piece. And you can see I have some controls here. I've got my distance, and this can be quite useful because I can offset from objects and do things. I've got the direction, one side, two side, and symmetrical. Okay, so two side allows me to set an amount downward as well as upward. Symmetrical obviously is going to extrude the same amount up and down. The distance I can set here. So I have an option to do a taper angle. Taper angle is quite useful in more advanced design sort of technique. We might want to taper a design because it's, say, an injection molded part, and so it needs to have something like, say, draft. So we can taper objects. We also have a couple of different options here in terms of join, cut, intersect. These will come into play later when we have more objects that we're modelling and how they're interacting with each other. So for the moment, I'm just going to model one direction. I'm going to extrude 350 millimeters. We won't have any taper or any such other things. Okay. And so there's my first piece of geometry that I've modelled. Notice I've now got, I might just delete this guy so it's not confusing, this other category which is opened up, which is called bodies. You can see here we have the body of that first object we've modelled. Any other subsequent bodies that aren't relative to this i.e. they're a separate body, will come under as separate bodies. And we can rename these as well if we want to. I've also got the initial sketch here, which we can toggle the visibility. And we can do that with pretty much anything in here. We can toggle the visibility of elements. So primarily, with the extrude feature, what we want to do is we want to create a sketch, and then we're going to extrude and create a solid object. The other thing that we can do with extrude, and in this case I'm going to create a sketch on the top face, so I'm not using a plane this time, I'm actually using a face of the body. Note when you're doing this you need to have a flat face, you can't do it on a curved surface. And I'm going to create another circle. With this one, I'll show you a trick. I'm going to draw a line off the origin, and this line, I'm going to make it for construction. When I make for construction, that means that the modeling software automatically knows I'm not trying to do a feature with this piece of line work. This is purely reference for other bits of my geometry. What it now allows me to do is say, create a coincident. Now I've got a fully defined sketch, but this line won't be integrated into any sort of feature going beyond this. So you can draw lines which are essentially like using a pencil. You're essentially just using them for construction, not your final work. I'll finish that sketch. I'll come back to extrude. I'll select that sketch. And now I have two options. I can do more extrusion, or if I'm going into a body, it changes to a cut. And you can see now that I've managed to successfully remove material from that body. And these are the two fundamental options that we have within the extrude feature.